Ger, when did you first hear the Revolver album? And did you hear it as an album or did you hear individual tracks beforehand?
I suppose I would have heard the songs first very, very young, when my mother used to play the radio a lot, and you'd become aware of the Taxmans and the Eleanor Rigbys and, even Tomorrow Never Knows. And I think the Beatles they've been so prolific, and they've written songs to such a standard that every song on almost every album could have been a single. So all of these songs got constant radio play when I was a kid, and they still do, and you hear them all the time, and you wonder sometimes, were things singles or were they not, because they're just so good. And it is something then that I would have been aware of a lot of the songs individually before I realised what particular group of songs made what particular album.
Right.
So that would have been my first introduction, is just the fact that they're constantly on the radio, and they're constantly part of the canon, I think is the expression, like where they're just established, and they're wonderful in many different ways, and they're so well written as well that they're always going to catch your ear. There's so much radio stuff, especially nowadays, that kind of would just pass and you wouldn't even pay any attention to it. But these songs are just so well written and so well put together that I would have been aware, all right, okay, that's the Beatles, and oh, that one's the Beatles as well. And just you'd learn by just listening,
Right.
I would have been a teenager, like mid to late teens, before I actually realised what songs went on what album and why they work together.
And what you brought in, which is fantastic, is the vinyl album. That's how you would have heard the Revolver album first. And were you conscious of what an album, what the Beatles meant by an album, as opposed to probably would have, like the rest of us, either compilation albums or bought albums by bands, and there were collections of their singles.
Yeah, when you're young.
But did you understand what the Beatles had in mind, that this was an album of songs as opposed to an album of singles?
I think I did, because I was very interested in music from a very, very young age, and I would have started buying vinyl albums at 10 years of age, so Adam and the Ants and things like that, and I would have kind of, the way cinema has a language and a lot of art has a language, I would have understood the art of the album only by listening, if you understand. I would have listened to so many albums of so many different kinds of music because of my mother, because of friends, because of social groups and all these different kind of things. I would have heard albums quite a bit, and I would have spent all my pocket money as a child on albums, like literally all my pocket money. And it's friends of mine would be going out, and sometimes I wouldn't go out because I would have bought 2 cassettes that week, and that was it. That was the end of the money. But I would have understood then why albums work together, and I would have got it. But I wouldn't have bought, say, Beatles albums of my own until I was, say, 14, 15, 16. But you could see very, very early how the albums worked. They're so many different kinds of songs, and they kind of flow together as well, which is very, very interesting. They work as albums. A lot of times you buy records, and they kind of they're badly put together. They're badly assembled, and sequencing, I think, maybe is the proper term for it. But they're just badly put together. Whereas the Beatles don't have that problem at all. They even get that right. And I know they've had one of the arguments I have about the Beatles my whole life is the fact they had so much money that they could really have done whatever they wanted, and they really had a huge amount of talented people working with them. So I think that's a huge part of it too, is the songs are brilliantly produced, and they could have got a dulcimer player at 2 a.m. in the morning if they wanted one, and I think, of course they're talented songwriters, no doubt, but they have all those kind of, that team around them that were hugely talented, like George Martin and people like that, and that hugely helped them as well, I think. The albums are wonderfully assembled, and the songs, now maybe I've just heard it so much, but the songs seem to come in the right order, if you know what I mean. Nothing seems out of place, and I think that's another part of their gift as artists. They're just so well assembled.
When it comes to the great debate about who was the fifth Beatle, I'm picking up from what you said already that you think that George Martin was, in the sense that he was the conduit by which some of their more radical ideas, and the question of where they got their ideas and their influences and the psychedelia and all that sort of stuff is one thing. But do you think that George Martin has a presence on the album in the way that was noticeable, whereas before he was the guy who made sure that everything was recorded properly, as in a photograph?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. I think he does, because I think great producers are like great coaches, great conductors. They're there without you. They're subtly there. They're not necessarily in your face. You don't say, oh, that's a Martin thing or that's a Martin thing. But when you hear it, and when you hear how well produced it is, and when you hear all the discussions, like so much has been written about the Beatles, but so many times he stepped in and would have given very, very much needed and good advice in the right exactly at the right time. And I think definitely he was the fifth Beatle, because the sound is so immaculate that, you know, when you're an artist, when you're recording, you're maybe not able to, I mean, some artists can do, but step out of the situation and listen to yourself honestly. You do need someone to actually tell you, no, this sounds good, this sounds bad. Or to, like you're talking about the radical ideas, you do need someone to tell you, come on now, lads, that's ridiculous, or to stop you in a good way, but also then to encourage you if you're going down a road that can be productive and can actually create something new and something original. And I mean, the Beatles, especially with Revolver, I think it's their masterpiece personally. I think there was an expression about Elvis that, you know, before anyone did anything, Elvis did everything. I didn't think that was true about Elvis, but I definitely think it's true about the Beatles. And I think the Beatles just, there's so many genres of music and they just opened so many doors. I can't imagine what it must have been like to be a young person in 1966 when this came out and hearing, you know, all of these different instruments, all of these different kinds of songs, all of these different influences. And, you know, Tomorrow Never Knows at the end, which is all these kind of Buddhist, kind of spiritual, these ideas of spirituality, which are not in the Christian culture at all, or they wouldn't have been promoted in the Christian culture of, you know, oneness and being connected to the universe. And imagine as a young person listening to that and hearing that, those ideas for the first time, and your windows of perception opening, or whatever, the doors or whatever would say. I think that must have been absolutely fascinating. And I think everything that's on that side of things, the way things sound, the way things are orally get into your mind, I think it's George Martin, definitely. And I definitely think they would have been a totally different band without him. As the Phil Spector debate with Let It Be would kind of prove that theory in a way.
That's for a couple of years' time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When it comes to some of the effects, there's great store put in the engineering abilities of a guy like Jeff Emerick, and there were other names, but he was the main engineer that seemed to work with the Beatles a lot. Were you conscious of the things that you were hearing, and was part of your listening experience wondering, how do they do that? What did they do? And then, given that you've written songs, you've been in bands over the years or whatever, do you still listen to it and wonder how they got this effect? Because effects is a big part of this album, I think.
Well, the process as a teenager is, as a young person, as opposed to how did they do that, is what is that? You know, you'd hear this instrument, you say, what is that? Like, you know, then you kind of would catch and it'd be gone. You know, just be there for a couple of seconds. And when you actually start recording yourself, you realise how those little nuances in music can make or break an album. And if you have the right people in the room who can play instruments and understand how sound is constructed, you can create beautiful masterpieces. I often think of Astral Weeks by Van Morrison being a similar kind of experience, where you got this group of really talented session musicians and people together that could really give him what he wanted. And Van, of course, like the Beatles, had great songs, but when you have those kind of people that can put a sound effect pedal in, or can play an instrument that maybe you'd never heard of before, or play it in a different way, and someone who, like Nick Drake, who does all these different tunings, you know, that kind of thing, which can affect the whole ambience of a sound. When you have that kind of talent, and an engineer and a producer who understands how those little nuances can make such a difference, your album can just become something that's completely different than you ever possibly imagined. Like, as a songwriter, if I'm sitting on my own writing something, I've got a guitar and myself, and that's it. And I'll come up with the chords, I'll come up with the melody, and I'll have a song. But then if I give it over to a group of talented musicians, which sometimes I can't afford to do because it's so expensive, the top guys cost so much money, but when you do and you see what they bring back to you, and you say, I never heard that, I never heard all those little nuances in my head, but they are there because what you're singing is the melody line and it's changing all the time. And I think the Beatles had the right people in the right place. They had the core talent, which is the basics of everything. You can't, it doesn't matter what you have, you don't have the core talent and the songs. But they just had so many talented people around them that they understood the construction of sound. And I think, the engineer is hugely important. Again, I would give Martin a lot of the kudos for that. But it is the engineer as well, of course. And, of course, the fact that they just could have whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, so many bands I've liked over the years had brilliant talented songwriters, the Go-Betweens, the Trash Can Sinatras, American Music Club. But they never had the money and the contacts and the friends to actually make the kind of albums that the Beatles could have made. And you know yourself, in the 60s, there was the Zombies, there was the Animals, there was a huge amount of talent. But I don't think any of them had the opportunities to make albums like the Beatles had. And of course that comes with success, and there's a reason why they had so much money and so much power behind them. But I do think it makes a huge difference to what they do. The basic talent is there, no question. I'm not one of these people who questions the Beatles' talent. It's a dark alley to go down. It's ridiculous, really. But they definitely had a right group of people around them, and they definitely knew what worked.
When it comes to individual songs then, and I'm conscious that you said the album works as an album, and the sequence of it, you can't imagine the sequence of events. You now have the end of one song, intuitively, having listened to it a lot, the next song that's coming on as well. Are there songs on the album that stand out for you? And I know you're particularly a McCartney fan.
Yeah, well, I think I try and defend McCartney when I can, because of maybe what McCartney did afterwards, the fact that he got married and he stayed with the same woman, and the fact that he had kids and he was happy. I think he didn't have really necessarily a real drug habit, or he wasn't in as much trouble as maybe Lennon was, or he wasn't as controversial as Lennon was. I think he gets a raw deal when it comes to how history remembers them. I think Lennon is considered much more cool because of the things he did, and Harrison too. But I'm a huge believer in talent being cool. And my favourite songs on the album are all McCartney songs. I mean, if I look at Eleanor Rigby, as a writer, you're trying to capture the essence of human experience, if that doesn't sound, too pretentious. You're trying to capture loneliness, isolation, heartbreak. And if you look at Eleanor Rigby and For No One, especially on this album, how McCartney, his poetry, how he constructs the song, how he, what I call gut punch lyrics, where you go, Jesus, really, did he actually say that? Did he phrase it like that? I mean, if you listen to Eleanor Rigby, there's nobody getting out alive at the end of it. The priest, Father Mackenzie, he doesn't have any success in his career. He's a lonely life. He has absolutely no success from what the lyrics tell you. And at the end of the song, he's no better off than he was in the first place. And Eleanor Rigby is one of these sad people where she's alone. She clings to the church for some kind of meaning of life. She sees other people in the song getting married, which is fascinating, but she's not getting married. She cleans up the church for something to do, and she's alone every night. And she ends up dying in the church, and she's buried, and nobody came to her funeral. And like, you think the Beatles a few years before this, You Loves You, yeah, 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 and the kind of pop kind of thing. This is now McCartney writing songs at the depth of Leonard Cohen, Tom Waits, Townes Van Zandt. He's writing dark, dark stuff. Now the production, because the strings are so beautiful, you might, sing along to it and this kind of thing. And see, I think that's a real talent of a great songwriter, is you could be singing along to something that's extremely dark and extremely troubling. And I think McCartney, I mean, you talk about Lennon being cool because he writes about dark stuff. Look at this. Look at what McCartney wrote. Look at the depth he went into here. And I think it's an interesting thing as well to think this is a post-war generation. This is what he is. He's growing up in an industrialised Britain where he's seeing cities growing to massive proportions, but he's seeing lonely people everywhere. And he's seeing the fact that, I think it's my own theory, but I think that people in cities, when you see lonely people in cities, it's far more pronounced than in the countryside where everyone's kind of on their own. In a city, you expect to be able to find someone to talk to fall in love with, and you see other people doing this. But if you're alone, it's magnified much, much more. T.S. Eliot writes great stuff about this, but this is what McCartney's talking about here. He's talking about all the lonely people. Where do they all come from? He's seeing them everywhere. He's seen them maybe all around Liverpool. And it's crazy to think that, we are alone, ultimately. And he's not afraid to write about that. And then For No One, which is the other big song for me on the album, this is the thing I think that everybody, if they're honest, has experienced, where you're in love with somebody, and then one day you're not anymore. Or more so, they're not in love with you. And everything that was right before is now wrong. And she doesn't get in a rush to meet you. She's not in a rush to answer the phone to you. She's not laughing at your jokes anymore. And it's a horrible, cold feeling, and everybody has had that experience, I'm sure. And he's not afraid he doesn't pull any punches in the lyrics, she doesn't want anything to do with the guy in the song anymore. And at the end of it, there's no happy ending. There's no, she actually, she fell in love with him again at all. Not at all. And it's a really short song, it's about 3 minutes, and bump, it ends. For No One, it's over. And I think McCartney is writing on a very profound human level. And I don't think he ever gets the proper respect for that. I think he's caricatured as this happy-go-lucky kind of guy and, sure, he's a thumbs up, this kind of stuff. But he's writing songs on a very, very profound level. And I'm going to make the case to get him proper respect. Now, I know he's in the Beatles, so a lot of people say I should respect anyway, but I don't think he gets enough kudos. He's a fantastic writer, and he needs to be, reassessed.
If it comes to other tracks on the album, then, I mean, obviously, I actually agree with you in terms of the depth of the writing, because it's a major shift lyrically for Paul McCartney, whereas Lennon had kind of set out his stall earlier on, like things like Norwegian Wood, deeply personal stuff, very personal, to the point where you say, did he really put that out on a record and have people listen to it? He always had that openness and that kind of nakedness about himself, which was very refreshing. Do you have a favourite Lennon track on the album, or are you drawn to...
Oh, I definitely do. I mean, Tomorrow Never Knows would be the song, and it's only because it's such a unique piece of music. And because, as a teenager, I grew up in a very Catholic household. I grew up with a very staunch Catholic grandmother. I would have been an altar boy, all that kind of stuff. So I would not really, and in Catholic school back then as well, you don't hear about there's no such thing as other religions. It's people are going to heaven and everybody else is going to hell. And when you listen to Tomorrow Never Knows, you're hearing a complete new perspective on the world. You're hearing a different kind of spirituality, and the instrumentation, of course, is accentuating that. And it's making you do some follow-up reading, if you know what I mean. It's making you think, what's he talking about? And you think, okay, it's right, a Hindu kind of philosophy, kind of Buddhist philosophy. And you go away then and you find out about that, and it's a whole new world philosophically. And because of that, and because it's so unique, and you can read about it, I sometimes don't like to read too much about a song, because it's like teaching poetry, where you deconstruct it to such a degree that someone can't enjoy it. I think it's the same when you deconstruct music or art, or any kind of art really. And you realise that they were doing tape loops and they were playing stuff backwards, and there's all sorts of stuff going on to create that really unique sound. And I think orally, when I listened to the album, I think that's what really stood out to me as a really unique piece of music, as opposed to just brilliant songwriting, which is throughout the whole album. And even Harrison writes some great stuff on this album. But Tomorrow Never Knows would definitely be my favourite Lennon song, because when you heard that, whatever Lennon was before, he just became fascinating. You had to know, what is this guy talking about? Because this guy was like me, like you. He was a regular working class guy. He came from a regular family. He would have gone to the same kind of school, same kind of experiences, but yet here he was talking about Eastern spirituality. And he was probably taking all the drugs he shouldn't have took, but it was opening his mind and all this kind of stuff. And you were thinking, wow, he can change. He can become something different. He can have new worlds open to him. Maybe I can too. I found that very, very interesting when I was younger. But it was long before I understood what was actually happening in the song, if you know what I mean. And long before I probably fully understood what he was talking about either. But he set you on a path. You wanted to know more. And I think that's another sign of great songwriting, where you hear references to things that you don't really understand, and you got to go look it up. And see, when I was younger, there was no Google, so you really had to make an effort to look it up. And you couldn't ask the religion teacher about Buddhism because they wouldn't have told you. So you really had to make an effort to find out what are Buddhists into, and what are Hindus into, and how is their spirituality different than ours. And actually, yeah, I'd imagine he opened those kind of doors for a lot of people. I'm talking I would have heard these songs first in the 80s, but can you imagine hearing them in the 60s? Right. And can you imagine hearing Ireland in the 60s, which must have been just, mind-blowing.
When it comes to the album as a whole, and I suppose, maybe I'll ask you about Harrison's contribution, because, the interesting thing is on the album he's down as having 3 songs. Now, there's a big discussion about the fact that Paul McCartney played lead guitar on Taxman. He also plays some amazing bass on the album, but it is a Harrison song.
He's a very good bass player, actually.
And he's got Harrison has 3 songs on the album. Are there any of them that made you kind of stand out? Like Love You Too is the one that's very obviously, Indian in nature, and it's got Indian instrumentation and Indian kind of lyrics.
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely going down that road, very much so, more I think even than the other 2. I think he was very interested in that kind of, that lifestyle, the Hare Krishna idea. He was very interested in that kind of, Eastern spirituality. And, afterwards he was, he explored that a lot as well in his solo work. But for me, actually, my favourite song by him is Taxman, because of my left-wing politics. I find the fact that, of what they were actually talking about, the fact you just kind of, as you're growing up, you don't even really understand what taxes are, but that someone comes and takes it off you. But the fact that he was actually dealing with something political in the lyrics gives another slant to the album. And that's why I think it's probably the song that stands out most. I mean, the other two are beautiful melodies, and I think that's really what he does well. You know, his solo album, All Things Must Pass, is just a stunning piece of beautiful sounds, if you know what I mean. It's just, you put it on, it just flows over you, and you can just enjoy it without really thinking too deeply about what he's talking about. Orally, it sounds fantastic. But I think those other two songs do that in this album. But I think Taxman, because of the politics, because of the kind of the social commentary kind of side of things, I think it makes it's a very interesting start to an album that goes a lot of different places. Here's politics right in your face, bang, straight away. Deal with it. You know, this is not an album. This is not going to be She Loves You, yeah. This is going to be, you're going to be thinking, you're going to be analysing, you're going to be dealing with issues, boom, straight in. And I think that's very brave. You know the way they say the best thing to ruin a dinner party is religion and politics? I don't think they're afraid of that at all. I think here we are, loads of religion, loads of politics, deal with it. And I think that shows huge development in their songwriting from what came before as well. This, to me, is where the Beatles get interesting.
If you had to sell this album to somebody who'd never heard it, do you think you could muster a kind of a couple of sentences if somebody said, "What's this album like? Is it worth my listening to it?" Is there a short way, other than them listening to the album, which is ultimately, you know, because you can only influence people so much. You say, look, just listen to the album, see what you think, come back and we'll talk about it. And that was the listening experience we had, you know, pre-internet, pre all of those things.
Much better times.
But if you had to persuade somebody who was new to the Beatles and particularly new to this album, what way would you describe it to them?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I would always come from the songwriting aspect of to say, what are the quality of songs like? And I would have no qualms to say to any young person that if you want to learn how to be a songwriter, listen to this. Listen to the depth of what they're talking about. Listen to the way they form sentences in a poetic way. Look at the cadences, listen to the cadences, listen to the overdubs, as we call them. Listen to the harmonies, the melodies. Look at the range of songs that are on this album. Like, this is not just a big problem with bands nowadays, and I'm kind of reluctant to say it, but a lot of Irish bands is they kind of get a template. This is the kind of song we're going to write, and they just rewrite it again and again and again and again. And there's no reason why I need to hear a second album by a band like that. Whereas the Beatles, they give you 14 songs of such diversity and such, you know, there is so much as well that you can learn when you listen to this album. So if you want to know about songwriting and how to do it, listen to this album. If you want to know about melodies, harmonies, listen to this album. If you want to know how to use instruments in an interesting way, how to write hook lines, which a lot of bands forget nowadays, the ear needs something to draw it in. You need that little kind of, you know, even 3 or 4 notes that are going to draw you in. Listen to this album, because they're all over it. Like, I hear the opening bars of any of these songs, straight away I know the song. And that's something that would be, if you were doing songwriting 101, those are kind of things you'd have to get right. And I think this band, you know, it's obvious saying it because they're the Beatles, but I think they knew all this instinctively. And I think that's a fascinating thing about songwriting and artists, who they could go into a studio and just, here it is, this is what we do. And the innocence of creativity is all over this album. And the fact that, you know, you keep the listener interested. The fact, now I know this is more than 2 sentences, sorry, but you keep the listener interested by the next song is 100% going to be different than the last one. You are not going to get bored.